What kind of leader needs a foreign army to control his own people? That question exploded across Kenya when General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, son of Uganda's long-serving ruler, tweeted a promise. If Ruto needs support from UPDF, we shall provide. Not a whisper, a declaration. For the first time in East Africa's history, a general from one country openly offered troops to protect the president of another, not from invasion but from his own citizens. And suddenly the border between nations blurred. But more than that, the line between sovereignty and submission began to vanish. If this is not a warning, then what is subscribed to Spirit of Africa? Because what's unfolding is not just a headline, it's a test of our future. And someone must speak before the silence becomes permanent. On July 7, 2023, the people of Kenya returned to the streets. Saba Saba, once a day of democratic defiance, rose again. From Nairobi to Kisumu, chants echoed, "Kenya deserves better." But what met them wasn't riot police. It was the military. The Kenya Defense Forces rolled into civilian neighborhoods with armored vehicles, combat rifles, and low-flying helicopters. FN SCAR rifles designed for war zones, not city streets, were pointed at unarmed citizens. Protesters were treated not as voices to hear, but as threats to neutralize. Then came the silence from above. No apology, no investigation, only a cold declaration from the president: we will not allow mayhem. But the mayhem did not come from the people. It came from the very state meant to protect them. And as the nation braced for what might come next, something unexpected stirred beneath the tear gas and silence. It was not a political party, not a union. It was a generation young, leaderless, unafraid. They filmed everything. They organized without hierarchies. And even as armored trucks rolled past, they whispered one phrase again and again: Ruto must go. But the pressure didn't just rise from within, because just when the regime feared its own youth, a voice from beyond the border made everything worse. It did not begin with a tweet. It began years earlier when two men shook hands in front of flashing cameras and something unseen passed between them. Not diplomacy, not fraternity, something colder, something heavier. It was a transfer of understanding that in this continent, power could be taught, inherited, and duplicated, not through elections, but through calculation. In 2015, before the titles and parades, William Ruto stood on foreign soil, not as a visitor, but as a campaigner. He traveled to Uganda to publicly support Yoweri Museveni's re-election. Museveni does not need Kenyan help to win, he said, and yet he gave it. That moment was not diplomatic theater. It was a signal. The lines between two regimes were beginning to blur, and the handshake that day was not ceremonial. It was strategic. Years passed, and with each one, the resemblance grew sharper. The yellow branding of Ruto's United Democratic Alliance mirrored the tones of Museveni's national resistance movement. Their language toward the International Criminal Court hardened in unison. Their disdain for civil society, for protest, for outside accountability moved in parallel. Policies became synchronized, and then silence did too. Museveni had ruled since 1986, shaping Uganda into a fortress where dissent was crushed before it could breathe. He abolished term limits. He centralized the military. He shifted public conversation from democracy to stability, and over time, the republic became a family estate. But now Kenyans began to see echoes of that same transformation at home. In Ruto's Kenya, disagreement grew quiet. Ministries spoke with one voice. Journalists reported visits from unknown men after publishing critical stories. Activists were followed. Surveillance increased. And all the while, the government's voice remained calm, measured, disciplined, like a man who no longer needed to respond to public pressure because he had learned not to fear it. Then came the arrests. Ugandan activists, long critical of Museveni, began to disappear on Kenyan soil. 36 opposition members, pastors, youth leaders, women organizers were detained in Western Kenya and handed over in silence. No charges, no trial, no protest. Just movement. Quiet, deliberate cross-border suppression. And for many Kenyans, the question shifted from outrage to fear: whose orders were these? Because if Kenya was capturing another country's dissidents, on whose behalf was it acting, Kampala's or its own? In Eldoret, Kisumu, Nairobi, graffiti appeared: no to UPDF, yes to liberty. On talk radio, callers spoke not of taxes or corruption, but of something more existential. Was their country still a home for freedom, or had it become the extension of another regime's arm? Muhoozi's tweet didn't create that fear. It revealed it. Because only someone who felt entitled to Kenya's political space would dare declare a military pledge so brazenly, so publicly. This wasn't strategy. It was certainty. Behind closed doors, no one needed to ask what came next. The signs were already there. Budget shifts showed growing funds for intelligence and defense. Public discourse tilted toward loyalty and sacrifice. Dissent began to be recast not as disagreement, but as betrayal. Even music and art, once fearless, were labeled dangerous. The government no longer argued with critics. It simply outlasted them. A member of parliament said it plainly, "We are not just changing policy, we are changing who we are." And the people, bruised but not yet broken, began to feel something few had dared name aloud. The Museveni doctrine was no longer confined to Uganda. It was being downloaded into Kenya's systems, its language, its logic. One does not need tanks to declare war on democracy. One only needs to normalize its opposite, to make fear reasonable, to make silence patriotic, to make protests suspicious. And when those ideas take root, the structure collapses from within. What Ruto and Museveni have built is not a military alliance. It is an ideological compact, one built on the belief that people cannot be trusted and therefore must be controlled, that the press must be tamed, that the court must be delayed, that the street must be watched, and when the people speak, they must be answered not with conversation but with choreography. But power built on borrowed methods always risks collapse, because what begins as admiration quickly becomes dependence. What begins as inspiration becomes imitation. And soon sovereignty itself begins to rot from the inside out. So the people ask, is this Kenya? Or is it the outline of something else? And if we do not name it now, this shadow forming between borders, this compact sealed in silence, then the next time a foreign general tweets about sending troops, it may not feel shocking at all. It may feel expected, and that is the final warning. Because when the arrival of foreign soldiers no longer surprises a people, it means the occupation has already begun, not on the land, but in the mind. And just as the people began to fear the occupation of the mind, the next blow came not in secret, but in public view. The silence of suspicion was pierced by something far louder, far more direct. A single tweet. If Ruto needs support from UPDF, we shall provide. 13 words. But behind them, a continent trembled. Because this time, it was not a whisper from the shadows, not a rumor of diplomatic collusion. It was a declaration of military readiness made by General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, commander of Uganda's army and son of the continent's longest ruling president. He didn't couch it in diplomatic language. He didn't pretend it was about regional peace or humanitarian aid. He was not answering a call for help from a neighboring people. He was offering soldiers to another president to put down his own people. It was the final mask falling from a game long played in darkness. For those who had doubted the existence of a deeper alliance between Museveni and Ruto, this was no longer theory. It was policy announced in 140 characters. In Nairobi, reactions erupted instantly. News channels ran breaking coverage. Talk radio burned with disbelief. Across social media, a single question echoed from screen to screen. Who gave him the right? Who gave a foreign general the authority to treat Kenya like a war theater? Who empowered him to promise boots on Kenyan soil as if sovereignty was something negotiable? Who opened the door for foreign troops to become a domestic option? But maybe the better question was, had the door already been opened? Because even before Muhoozi's tweet, the signs were there. The quiet arrests, the mirrored language, the ideological mimicry. And now this, an offer of occupation disguised as friendship. It was not just an insult, it was an awakening. For many Kenyans, the betrayal struck deeper than any police baton. The memory of Saba Saba was still fresh. The protesters chanting beneath helicopters, the children carried away from tear gas clouds, the slogans shouted through cloth masks and choked breath. And now they were being told that if things escalated, Ruto could call in a foreign army to finish what local security forces had started. This was no longer governance. It was strategy. This was no longer policing. It was preparation. From Kibera to Kisumu, the fear became visible. Mothers began whispering warnings to their sons. Artists pulled down their murals. University students canceled marches. Not out of weakness, but out of calculation, because if Kenyan troops had fired rubber bullets, what would foreign soldiers do? And if foreign troops did fire on Kenyan citizens whose flag would cover the coffins? A continent watched in eerie silence. No African Union statement. No diplomatic protest. No reassurance from Ruto's office. Just the steady hum of something dangerous solidifying beneath the surface. And then the narratives began to shift. Ruto's allies tried to downplay the statement. It was just a tweet, they said. It does not reflect official policy. But the people had heard it too clearly. The words were not hypothetical. They were loaded. They were personal. Because in a time when protesters were being painted as criminals, a general offering troops did not feel like a suggestion. It felt like a green light. The Kenyan constitution does not permit foreign troops on domestic soil without parliamentary approval. But what is the constitution to a man backed by silence and surrounded by soldiers? And what happens to democracy when the ballot box begins to look more like a checkpoint? In marketplaces, old men remembered the Mau Mau. Young activists invoked Thomas Sankara. Christian preachers quoted Exodus. Muslim clerics recalled the battles of early Islam. Everyone, it seemed, was grasping for history, some thread, some anchor, some clarity in the fog of what now felt like a second occupation. Not from Europe this time, but from within Africa itself. Because when a general from a neighboring country promises troops to suppress your protest, you are no longer in a disagreement. You are in a struggle for national survival. The betrayal was not just that Muhoozi said it. It was that no one in power condemned him. Not Ruto, not Museveni, not the African Union. And so the betrayal grew louder, not as a scream, but as a silence that echoed through parliament halls, press rooms, and prayer circles. Kenyans began to realize this is not just a political season. This is a transformation, a shift in the logic of the state, a merging of two regimes beneath a single doctrine that authority must be protected even if democracy is lost in the process. And now, every moment of resistance, every poster printed, every student who speaks, every marcher who refuses to sit down is no longer just protesting taxes or corruption. They are defending the border, not the one on the map, but the one between legitimacy and tyranny. Because if foreign troops land on Kenyan soil to suppress Kenyan citizens, then the nation is no longer a republic. It becomes something else. Something unspoken. And what Muhoozi revealed is not just a promise, it is a blueprint, one the whole continent must now decide whether to follow or to burn. And perhaps that is why in the darkest corners of Kenyan cities, another question has begun to surface. Is this the moment we finally choose what kind of Africa we want? Because what comes next will not be solved by politicians. It will be decided by people. The betrayal did not come with sirens. It did not arrive in headlines or armored trucks. It came in silence. It came quietly under the cover of night beneath the hum of unmarked vehicles between borders where no camera dared linger. In the months that followed Muhoozi's declaration, something even more dangerous than foreign troops took hold, a quiet merging of repression. Kenyans began to notice a strange rhythm in the news. Ugandan dissidents, journalists, pastors, student leaders who had fled Museveni's regime were being arrested inside Kenya. Some while seeking asylum, some while giving interviews, some simply disappeared. One by one they were rounded up and handed back. No trial, no public records, no defense, just names. Vanished. The official term was deportation, but the truth was far uglier. This was rendition, an informal, illegal handover of political opponents to the very government they fled. No one said it on record. No one signed their names to the orders. But everyone involved knew what was happening. And worse, they knew what would happen next. In Kampala, families waited for calls that never came. Lawyers filed habeas petitions in courts that responded with blank stares. Churches prayed. Activist groups screamed. But Kenya remained silent. Because Kenya was no longer neutral, it was now a participant. The betrayal was not only in the action, it was in the absence of outrage. There were no protests in parliament, no prime-time interviews, no journalists granted access to the border stations, no ministers forced to answer why young asylum seekers from Uganda were dragged from safe houses and put on planes bound for their own persecution. One activist, before being detained, sent a final voice note. "If you hear nothing from me, it's because they agreed." Kenya and Uganda. They agreed that silence is cheaper than justice, that recording never made the news. But it circulated in WhatsApp groups, in activist networks, in underground churches, and with it came a new chilling realization. Kenya was no longer a sanctuary. For decades, Kenya had been a place where the persecuted ran to, not from. From South Sudanese rebels to Rwandan exiles to Congolese journalists, it was the last line of refuge, a space between war and diplomacy. But now it had become a corridor for suppression, not because its people changed, but because its leaders chose the pact over the people. And while politicians smiled at Pan-African summits, their security forces acted as extensions of each other. The border didn't disappear because of war, it disappeared because of compliance. That's how authoritarianism spreads, not just with tanks, but with the quiet consent of neighbors. Some call it brotherhood, some call it security cooperation, some say it's just bureaucracy. But the man deported never sees the difference, and the family that buries him does not care what form the paperwork took. In one case, a Ugandan journalist was tracked for weeks in Nairobi, then seized outside a guest house. Witnesses said he shouted, "Don't take me back, I'll die there." The officers looked away. He was gone within the hour. His name never made the official blotter. In another, a university student who had criticized Museveni's age limit removal was captured in Eldoret. He had legal refugee status. It didn't matter. Within 48 hours, he was back in Kampala. Within a week, he had vanished from the prison logs. And Kenya said nothing. The betrayal was systemic. And to make it worse, it was being done in the name of African unity. What a cruel irony. The same Pan-Africanism that once inspired freedom fighters was now being twisted to justify cross-border suppression. We are brothers, they say. We must help each other maintain peace. But whose peace and at what cost? If unity means the strong protect each other from their own citizens, then unity is no longer liberation. It is a cartel. It is a shared silence held together by fear. And the people, those who still believe in the Africa of Mandela, of Sankara, of Wangari Maathai, they are left to watch as the words of the old songs grow hollow. Because how do you sing of freedom in a land where fugitives are no longer safe and borders are no longer boundaries? How do you tell your children that Kenya is still different, still sovereign, still proud, when your country hands over the hunted without blinking? In this new order, there are no tanks rolling down Kenyatta Avenue. There are no bombs, no grand proclamations, just names on lists, just neighbors becoming informants, just silence where outrage should be. And in that silence, something is dying, not just law, not just trust, but the idea of Kenya itself as a place that stands apart, as a voice that dares to challenge, as a home for the dream of freedom. And so while the world debates, tweets, and conferences, the real battle happens far away from microphones. It happens in holding cells, in immigration queues, in courtrooms where lawyers wait for clients who never arrive, and in the eyes of the next young activist who dares to speak only to wonder if the next knock on the door will come from his own government or from a foreign one given permission to act in its name. This is the quiet betrayal. And unless it is named, unless it is shouted into the daylight, it will become the new normal. Not with a bang, but with a handshake. It wasn't just the silence of betrayal that haunted Kenya, it was the logic behind it. Because slowly, quietly, something far more dangerous than foreign troops or police raids began to emerge. A doctrine, a new African doctrine. One that did not require coups or tanks or assassinations, one that moved through laws and budgets and coded language, one that used stability as a weapon and foreign friendship as its mask. It was the doctrine of control, not controlled by fear, but by fatigue, not controlled by law, but by silence. Under this doctrine, a president need not declare martial law. He only needed to let the violence become routine, let the headlines blur into apathy, let the protests become static on the screen. Because when outrage becomes regular, repression becomes invisible. This is what Gen Z in Kenya came to understand. Not through theory, but through bruises and blood. They returned to the streets in July, not to ask for reform, but to reject the system outright. They had no political leaders, no party, no billionaire sponsor. They moved through Telegram, through Instagram Reels, through whispers in cafes and threads on Reddit. But their voice was clear: Ruto must go. And the regime understood something that even the elders had missed. This generation was not protesting policy. They were protesting obedience. So the response was surgical. Not to kill them, but to injure them just enough to silence momentum. Shoot them in the legs, said the president, as if democracy were a creature to be maimed, not confronted. Hospitals began reporting a strange pattern: young protesters with shattered femurs, torn tendons, embedded bullets in their knees. The message was anatomical: you may speak, but you will never march again. And yet they returned. They returned with bandages, with tears, with placards taped to crutches, because in their hearts something had broken and could not be repaired by fear. But what future awaited them? Their own leaders painted them as destabilizers. The continental bodies stayed silent. And worse, Uganda, Rwanda, even Tanzania began sharing data and tactics. Kenya was no longer alone in its repression. It had become the prototype. And just when it felt like every border had been sealed in complicity, when every escape was closing, eyes turned westward, to a land with no ocean, no oil, no sympathy from the IMF. But something else, a different kind of leadership. In Burkina Faso, a man stood who had once been mocked, doubted, dismissed as a phase. Ibrahim Traoré. He was not perfect. He was not polished. He wore no designer suits. But what he carried was something rare in African politics: a willingness to listen to the youth and trust them with the nation's future. While Ruto authorized snipers on rooftops, Traoré handed rifles to farmers to defend their villages. While Museveni surveilled students, Traoré sent them to rebuild schools and clean rivers. While other presidents begged the IMF for another loan, Traoré rejected it outright and asked his people to build what they had with what they were. In Kenya, Gen Z was called threats. In Burkina Faso, they were called guardians. He didn't flatter them with slogans. He gave them responsibilities. And in return, they gave him loyalty not as a ruler but as a mirror. Because when a leader dares to believe that his people are not the problem, they often become the solution. That is the difference. In Nairobi, young protesters were limping from tear gas canisters. In Ouagadougou, young volunteers were building solar panels in the Sahel. 2 nations, 1 continent. And yet the divide was not colonial. It was spiritual. Because this is not about East versus West Africa. It is about the choice every leader must now make: rule through obedience or lead through faith. Traoré chose faith, not the kind preached only in churches or mosques, but the kind that believes a black nation can rise without kneeling to foreign lenders, without selling its minerals, without fearing its own youth. And Kenya, once a shining example of democratic promise, now finds itself caught in the shadows of its own contradictions. And that's why the Gen Z revolution matters. Because they are not just rebelling against taxes or police brutality, they are rebelling against the doctrine of control, against the idea that African citizens must forever be governed by men who fear them more than they love them. And perhaps that is why the bullets aimed at their legs have not broken them. Because they have seen what is possible. Because they have watched another young man across the continent dare to say, "My people are not a threat, they are the power." And maybe that is why this generation refuses to back down. Because deep down they know that this is no longer a protest. It is a battle between 2 futures. And one of them has already begun to rise, sun-scorched, dust-covered, held together not by fear, but by belief. And if Kenya can still remember its name, then maybe it too can remember what it means to choose leaders who serve, not dominate. Because in this continent today, no regime can stop an idea whose time has come. They thought the fire would die in the streets. They thought bullets could kill memory, that silence would erase betrayal. They thought Gen Z would log off, limp away, and forget. But the truth is this: you can injure a body, but you cannot shoot a spirit. What happened in Kenya is no longer a domestic issue. It is no longer about tax hikes or fuel prices or political infighting. It is a mirror held up to the face of every African nation. A mirror that asks, who do you serve? And what will you betray to keep your seat? Because as young Kenyans marched through clouds of tear gas, young Burkinabe were planting trees where mines used to be. Because while Nairobi drowned in excuses, Ouagadougou dared to dream. Not because Burkina Faso had more wealth or better weapons, but because it had something rarer, a leader unafraid of his own people. That is the fire now, not the rage of rebellion, but the clarity of contrast. And from that contrast, the question rises not just for Ruto, not just for Museveni, but for all of us. Do we stand with those who shoot into the future or those who build with it? The line has been drawn, not by borders, but by vision. And if you are reading this, watching this, feeling this, then you are part of that line. Because this is not just Kenya's test, it is Africa's moment of choice. Will we be a continent of silent complicity or one of courageous unity? Will we continue to trade our sovereignty for weapons and deals? Or will we dare to trust the power in our youth? The bullets have spoken, the betrayals are logged, the silence has been heard loud enough. Now it's time for a new sound. A sound made not by armies or presidents, but by people who refuse to look away. So if this story speaks to your heart, do not let it stop here. Like this video if you believe African youth deserve more than fear. Comment your voice because silence is no longer neutral. Subscribe to Spirit of Africa because this is only the beginning. And as we close this chapter, remember, every regime fears the same thing. Not the protest, not the tweet, but the day the people finally say, we are not afraid of you anymore. That day is coming, and maybe that day is already here. Amen.